Welcome to the How of Business with your host, Henry Lopez, the podcast that helps you start, run, and grow your small business. And now, here is your host.
Welcome to this episode of the How of Business. This is Henry Lopez. My guest today is Greg Chasson. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to this. In this conversation, Greg is going to share with us to help us really answer that question. How do we understand and mitigate the negative impacts of perfectionism? I'm a perfectionist, certainly. So I'm looking forward to this, including that it can lead to, according to Greg, burnout and staff turnover. Those are some of the key impacts that it can have on our small businesses. So that's what we're going to chat about with Greg today. To get more information about the How of Business, including the show notes page for this episode, and to learn more about my one-on-one and group coaching programs, just visit thehowofbusiness.com. I also encourage you to please subscribe to the show wherever you might be listening so you don't miss any new episodes. So let me tell you a little bit more about Greg. Dr. Greg Chasson is an international keynote speaker, an esteemed psychologist, a board-certified cognitive behavioral therapist, a researcher, and an educator. He's an associate professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience, where he's also the director of behavioral interventions of the Obsessive-Compulsive and Related Disorders Clinic. And what we're going to chat about today, he's the author of a new book titled Flawed, Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. Greg lives in the Chicago area. So once again, Greg Chasson, welcome to the show.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this.
Absolutely. And obviously in the very brief bio there, I could have gone with the longer bio. You've got all of the credentials, all of the experience, all of the background in this field. So you come to it really, I think I'm using the right term, really from a clinical perspective, would you say?
Absolutely. I think that I see this issue through a clinical lens, but also from a personal perspective. I've struggled with some of my own perfectionism, not to the degree that I see in my clinic here at the University of Chicago, but certainly enough to be able to have my finger on the pulse of the pattern that I see time and time again, and how this probably leaks into all sorts of work settings. And so this is partly what inspired the book. I just see a lot of these patterns in the real world, and I thought that there needed to be a little bit more discourse around this. A lot of people think that perfectionism is a good quality, or at least that that it's confusing for people, but I see it as quite a detriment to a functioning, efficient workplace.
Mm-hmm. And let's explore that for a moment, because I think you say that specifically in the book, that really it can be a double-edged sword.
Yep.
Certainly in my observation, Greg, most, if not many, entrepreneurs tend to be perfectionists. I think it's one of the things that gets us here. What are is that your observation as well?
I see some perfectionism in entrepreneurs. However, I find that it actually probably holds back most of them. The people who tend to launch into the stratosphere of success tend to be the opposite. Perfectionism is defined by rigid thinking. It's defined by having excessive expectations. And those two things really hamper innovation. They hamper risk taking. They hamper efficiency and speed. And so in a lot of ways, to be a successful entrepreneur and to become a really, big wig CEO and to really make it into the stratosphere, it often requires an anti-perfectionistic approach.
Yeah.
You tend to see a lot of the perfectionistic tendencies in the lower level, and I don't mean low, I mean maybe one level lower, like the C-suite, CFO, chief technology officer. They tend to be the more perfectionistic of most organizations.
Yeah, well said. I have to agree with that. I guess where I was going is that it tends to be those of us who see those things that are broken and want to fix them. Those of us who maybe we got to business ownership because we were the best at something technically. But I completely agree with you. That is what gets in the way then from us being able to become an entrepreneur, where we're leveraging other resources. And perfectionism keeps us from being able to do that, because nobody can ever do it as good as we do.
Right. And therefore you have a hard time delegating. Delegating is a tough thing to do for a perfectionist. And, small business owners, other entrepreneurs, you got to be able to delegate if you want to scale.
In my personal experience, I think where it comes from is my dad's relationship with me, and he was a perfectionist and he passed it on to me. But I think also maybe we're born, we're predisposed. I mean, that's the whole nature versus nurture question. But in your experience and the experience with yourself, is it a combination of we're born with a certain personality and then maybe something happens to us in childhood that leads to this? What's your observation from a clinical perspective?
Yeah, I think that you're right on target. It really is not an or, it's an and. And most things in this world are both nature and nurture and their interactive effect. In this case, I think that we are born with a tendency towards neuroticism or anxiety and needing things to feel right and just right. And those tendencies are built into our temperament. And then over time, we learn maybe from our father, maybe from our coworkers, maybe from our peers about doing things in a way where mistakes are unacceptable, that there's a right or wrong way of doing things. Rules are rigid and not meant to be broken, even if it means we're undermining principles or values. I think a lot of that can be learned, and then it dovetails with our biological dispositions, and then it leads to this presentation of perfectionism.
Yeah, yeah, well said. As you're saying that, it makes me think that I've I realize and I know, and I'm not the only one, obviously, that our system, our education system, in primarily is really still about indoctrinating us. And I know I'm using that word harshly, but into teaching us to be employees, to color within the lines, to not make mistakes, right?
Right.
And so it really it adds to that. So if I naturally am predisposed or because of my relationship, whatever, the education system reinforces that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does, especially early on. I do believe that there's a tendency to believe there's a right or wrong way, a right or wrong answer, and a lot of the material being covered, there very well may be a right or wrong answer, but the message, whether implicit or not, is that, you got to do things right or wrong, and the world is very binary. And then you combine that with this sort of toxic achievement culture in general,
Right.
grades and who's the best student and who's the valedictorian. And, it really becomes this really difficult interaction between this achievement need and this sort of good soldier mentality of just do what you need to do, color in the lines, there's a right or wrong. I think it stifles creativity, it stifles individuality. I think you start to see it crack a little bit when people go to college. And by grad school, they teach you to undo everything that you learned before. So that, I mean, it's true. I often
Mhm.
tell my
Yeah.
grad students that you got to unlearn everything they taught
All of a
you.
sudden, you got to learn critical thinking, right? And come up with your own
Exactly.
ideas. Yeah.
Critical thinking is so key, and being able to build knowledge and have knowledge about knowledge. And it really takes breaking the mold to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, well said. All right, we'll continue to explore that. But you said it here at the outset. The question I have for you now is, why did you write the book? You were seeing more and more of perfectionism being one of the many causes for the lack of effective work environments. And so is that and what else led you to writing the book? I'm curious.
I mean, I run the OCD clinic, the behavioral interventions component of it. So I do a lot of therapy and behavioral treatment with people who come in with obsessive compulsive disorder. And some of the correlates of OCD include perfectionism.
Hmm.
And so I'm sure you can imagine here at the University of Chicago, it tends to attract a very specific type of student, a specific type of faculty member and their family. We know the genetic components of this. And so basically, I have perfectionism coming out of my ears here at the clinic, and people come in, and I was just constantly giving them the same exact message from patient to patient to patient, and I started to develop my own conceptualization based on my experience in the therapy room, based on my own personal experience struggling with perfectionism to a degree, and then of course the research literature, which really I think informs a lot of what I do. And I thought that this needed to be scaled, that doing this one-to-one with an individual is certainly rewarding and helpful, but there are a lot of people out there who are struggling with this broken mentality, and it's time to expand and hopefully open up the world for a lot more people. I was
Mhm.
getting a lot of people in the room that were telling me about how much they were struggling at work.
Okay. I was
And
going to ask you that. How did it then segue into how is this impacting a work environment? Yeah.
well, I had a couple of different ways of arriving at the decision to write this book about work environments. The first was that I was hearing stories about people who were unable to retain their job. They were constantly behind. They
Mm.
were, one common uh, experience of people with perfectionism is procrastination. And so I would always be hearing about procrastination and getting in trouble at work and being unable to keep up and getting in trouble. And the real severe perfectionists have a very hard time keeping a job. And there's a whole segment of people out there that are not as severe, but really still struggling, and it's getting in the way of their success in the job. And so I thought, well, I'm sure managers and leaders would love to hear about this because I think it really obstructs things like productivity and a healthy workplace culture, which then, of course, leads to things like turnover, and that affects the bottom line. So my next thought was, well, let's see if we can provide some guidance for leadership because there's really nothing out there for them.
And going back to in this context, procrastination is one of the ways that people will deal with that perfectionism. That's one of the ways that it manifests itself in this context is putting things off, not getting things done, always coming up for reasons. You'll see that in work environments where, oh, I got busy doing this, so I couldn't get to that bigger project or whatever. But is it in part then you've observed that it's that fear, if you will, that I'm not going to get it perfect is one of the reasons I procrastinate?
Absolutely. And I have a framework that I convey in the book called the emphasis framework, where I have three different task types and emphasis types. There's emphasis A, which is to do the task with everything you got, give it a perfectionistic go, 110%. Then there's emphasis B, which is the get or done strategy. Just get it done. Doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be garbage, just got to get it done. And then there's the emphasis C framework, which is the I'm not going to do this at all. I'm just going to skip it, ignore it. And now all three of those are strategic. There's no judgment. Every one of them has a time and place. And really, the time and place depends on your values and the circumstance. What is important to you? And how do you triage your different effort levels? The problem with perfectionism is that they try to plan A everything, or they
Mhm.
try to emphasis A everything. And so what
Mhm.
happens is that they're giving 110% to everything. They're not picking their battles. And then what happens is that things get pushed off because you can't sustain that. And so things turn into emphasis C, not based on strategy, not based on your values, but instead because you just and couldn't get to it. Your
Right.
perfectionism chose your priorities for you.
Yeah. And that just feeds also into those chaotic environments where it seems like we're always putting out fires, we're always dealing with the problems and not making any foundational progress in our business.
Yeah, and there's nothing more exhausting and demoralizing than feeling like you can't keep up, you're constantly drowning, and you are
Hmm.
jumping from fire to fire without
Right.
a big picture understanding of how you're moving in the right direction.
Hmm. So we've been touching. So that is one thing to look for: productivity, burnout, turnover. Are those, or is there anything else also that I might look for if I'm listening as a business owner and I'm seeing those symptoms? Those and what else stands out to you when this is a problem in a work environment? What are the other symptoms?
I really think that you'll end up seeing if you see some rigidity of thinking, people having a hard time shifting from
Hmm.
one strategy to another, one tactic to another. They get sort of tunnel vision. They can't see the big picture and they get stuck on the details. These are really common features, and I don't think it needs to be said that that's an absolute creativity killer right
Yeah.
there. You
Yeah.
can't really think outside the box. And then I also see people who become so rigid and militant about rules, which is very common in perfectionism, that they sometimes do so at the expense of the underlying principle on which those rules are based.
Hmm.
So I give the example, a silly example, because it seems extreme, is you see a sign at a pool, it's summertime, we're all thinking about pools, and you're thinking, oh, don't run around the pool. There's this very clear rule. And it's built on a principle of, yeah, pools are dangerous. The water gets on the ground. It's slippery. You can crack your head open. Very dangerous. And the value on which that principle is based is safety. And so you have this structure, this nested structure that leads up to this rule of don't run near the pool. But if you get so hyper focused on this rule and become rigid around it, you can actually start policing it in a way that undermines the principles and the values on which it's based. So imagine a perfectionistic, rule-bound lifeguard that's whistling and yelling at a parent who's running to save a child in the pool who's drowning.
I see.
Right. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And it seems really silly and extreme, but imagine shades of this in the workplace. It's very toxic.
I can see immediately as I was thinking about that as an example, I apply it to what I talk about often, and I've tried in my businesses to empower our staff to be able to make decisions on behalf of a customer or a client. Let's say it's on a refund or taking care of a problem. If I've got such rigid rules that are around the fear of people stealing from us or taking advantage of us, then there's no way, then me telling an employee they're empowered to solve a problem is really, it's not worth anything, right?
Yep.
Because
exactly.
because of the rigidity of the environment that I've created there.
Yeah, something's coming out of your mouth, but it doesn't really match the reality, right? You have, it's like saying it's performative. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel accurate. It's not in the spirit of just accepting the occasional bad debt or the bad actor, and instead tries to control everything and try to dampen or essentially try to stop any such occurrence, as if that were even possible in the first place.
Right, exactly. Okay, let's explore this topic a little bit more because it's fascinating to me. But one of the things you talk about in the book related to this is that we may well be brainwashing employees through the onboarding process. And I think what you're talking about there, but you'll tell me if I'm on the right track, is that hope as I think about the whole onboarding process, which I'm very focused on in my businesses and my clients, it's very structured. It's the rules, it's the manual, it's the how you will do it correctly. Is that partly what you're talking about there with the brainwashing that we're doing subconsciously or unintentionally, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's part of it. There are other elements that I think contribute. Really, it's about the culture that's been created even from the outset. And it starts even with the job ad, honestly. It starts with the position announcement, and it works its way all the way until, somebody starts to become demoralized that they can't keep up with whatever the perceived expectations are.
I see.
And it doesn't really matter what the actual expectations are. It's really about the perceived expectations. And that is communicated in so many subtle and implicit ways. So again, it's about what's coming out of your mouth may not actually match what the reality is. But I think things like the employee manual, and you're right, being hyper focused on rules, maybe not really explaining what the purpose is of all of this.
The
Or
value or the spirit behind it, that sometimes gets lost, right? Or doesn't even
right,
get communicated for that matter.
right.
Why do we have the no run sign? That usually doesn't get explained. It's just, listen, there's a do not run sign, don't run. That's all we tend to say.
Yeah, and humans aren't necessarily the most compliant of animals. So, when you see a rule like that, there are some people who ignore it, some people who follow it, and some people who do the opposite just on purpose.
Sure.
And I think you get those employees too. And the problem is we don't do a good job of, I think every organization has a mission or a vision statement or something to that effect. And if you don't, it might be wise to put one together. But I think what's more important is that it actually connects with the reality of the organization. And then it's carefully connected to much more concrete rules and policies. And I would also suggest ways in which those rules and policies are flexible or open for discussion.
Okay. Right. So the other thing you talk about is should I interpret this as I should avoid hiring perfectionists? I don't think that's what you're saying, but tell me about that.
Oh, absolutely not. That's an important point that I'm glad you prompted me to talk about. Is perfectionists are going to be some of your strongest employees. I mean, as you were indicating earlier, there's some idea that it probably got you to where you are to this day, and that it does afford you some really good qualities. Some of those qualities are honesty. They tend to be much more honest. They tend to be much more loyal. They tend to be very detailed oriented, which is a nice compliment to your big picture thinking employees. They tend to have a very high level of conscientiousness. And to be honest with you, if I had to pick an ingredient for an employee, I think I would start there. It's a tremendously positive quality. And they also tend to be your hardest working person. I mean, by virtue of the perfectionism, they're tripling down on everything. So they're going to be your hardest working person in the room.
Yeah.
Not the most efficient by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think it's a real mistake to try to weed them out of the workforce. In fact, I would instead, the message of the book is, hey, let's try to mitigate some of the negative components and how it impacts the business and the environment. And instead, let's really promote and facilitate the good qualities that come with perfectionism.
This is Henry Lopez with a brief break from this episode to share a special offer from our show sponsor and trusted service partner, Ustas. Ustas specializes in digital marketing services for small business, including websites, SEO, social media management, and pay-per-click advertising. You know how important it is to promote your business online, but the world of digital marketing can be confusing and expensive. That's why you need Ustas, a digital marketing company you can trust and who are dedicated to helping small business owners. I've had the pleasure of working with Ustas and their founder, Adam Kirk, for several years now, and they are my trusted service partner for websites and digital marketing. Ustas really understands that every business has distinct digital marketing needs. That's why they take a results-driven approach to all your digital marketing. They start with a comprehensive analysis of your business, your goals, and your target market, and then they develop a tailored digital marketing strategy that's designed to take you where you want to go online. Ustas is offering a special discount for the How a Business Podcast listeners. Just let them know you heard about Ustas on the How a Business Podcast. And you can schedule a no-obligation consultation with Ustas to see how they can help you with your website and digital marketing needs. To learn more and to take advantage of the special offer, please find a special link to Ustas on the show notes page for this episode at thehowabusiness.com. And the book we're talking about, if you just joined us or joined halfway through the show here, is Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. And we're chatting with Dr. Greg Chasson. And so what I want to move to next is this whole mistake on purpose. And so when I read that initially, as a business owner in particular, I was like, really? I want my people to make mistakes on purpose? And I get it. It's a matter of context, but just introduce that concept for me and then help me reconcile if what I'm making are, precision, highly engineered widgets or saving people's lives. How does that apply in that context? I think you probably anticipated I was going to go there with this concept, right?
Absolutely. And it does give a lot of people indigestion thinking about it, especially your small business owner or your business owner.
Because again, we might give it lip service. Oh, yeah, no, this is a safe environment. But then, come on, at the end of the day, I really want my people to do the job correctly, don't I?
You do, but at what expense, right? So what is it costing them in order to do the job correctly? And it's not about whether the job should be done correctly. It's about which jobs really need all of that attention and which can just get done. Does that make sense?
Yes,
And,
yes.
And so when you say, what about those widgets? What if I'm doing surgery? Do I want my surgeon to be, making mistakes while they're, cutting me open? Well, the answer is obviously no. But do I care about whether they logged something incorrectly on the note?
Right.
That's what I'm talking about is pick
everything else. I got to pick what is it that has to be done to a high, and there's very few of those environments, right? So most of us as small business owners don't have those environments, or even in our environments, there's a small number of roles that have to do a precise thing, maybe to a high level of accuracy. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Very rarely are the stakes as high as what some of these folks are experiencing. The bomb detonator person who's trying to, turn a bomb off, or, the surgeon. These are really high stressful jobs. And those are the moments where I would suggest mistakes are very problematic. But in the other hand, imagine the perfectionistic surgeon, and I treat many of these because I'm at the University of Chicago Medicine, who come in to see me because they are so perfectionistic that they cannot finish quick enough to get their person closed in time before it starts to become risky.
Interesting.
right? In
So
that
even
case,
in that environment, it can be taken too far.
absolutely. And surgeons will tell you that this is a real problem. You can't keep your patient open that long. It really could be quite deadly. And, whatever it is that you're getting stuck on doing perfectly is probably not nearly as risky as keeping them open on the table. And so there's a cost. And I think that's what's always forgotten or not calculated when they're thinking about, should I do this plan A or emphasis A? Should I do this emphasis B or C? Now, in the context of a small business, most of the mistakes that I suggest making on purpose are smaller and they're negotiated with the actual employee. And it's built into this model of exposure principles, exposure therapy, which is a type of cognitive behavior therapy. Now, you're not going to do therapy with your employee. You're probably not a therapist, but you can incorporate the principles, which I talk about in the book. And this involves creating increasingly difficult exercises in which you make mistakes and do not engage in any sort of behavior to seek reassurance, to check, to fix. Those are what we call safety behaviors. Procrastination is an example of that as well. And they serve to reduce your anxiety and to make yourself feel better, but in the long run, makes the perfectionistic anxiety and behavior worse. And so the idea is let's engage people in these little mistake-making exercises and then do so increasingly so it's more and more difficult from exercise to exercise. And it could be things like signing off the email with a misspelling. Instead of cordially, you say quarterly, right? And so it's missing a letter here or there. It's just nothing so pronounced that it's going to lead to someone dying.
Can you help me with is there an example that comes to mind? Because I'm not quite following how I execute the exercise.
Right. So you would create what's called a hierarchy in which you would create different exercises around the idea of making a mistake. So maybe, and the hierarchy is built on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being extreme anxiety, being chased by a tiger while holding lamb chops type of anxiety, right? And then 0 being just completely relaxed on the beach, right? And so where do different exercises fall on this scale? And if I said, I would like you to send an email
Okay.
to your coworker in which you misspell their name.
Interesting. Because it could be just as simple as that. Henry, I want you to, in your next email, misspell the name.
Right. And they'll say, oh my God, I can't do that.
I
That
can't
means,
do that. Yeah.
right.
That
That
freaks
would
me out.
be a 50 out of 100, right? And
Mhm.
so they do this enough times and you have them do this repeatedly over and over and over again. And they start to loosen their thinking around this. And then you up the ante a little bit. And on the next level of this hierarchy, maybe it's a little bit harder. Okay, now I want you to email your boss and misspell their name. Right. And what happens is that they work their way up this hierarchy to get to harder and harder things. Maybe by the end of it, they're not just creating a typo in the name, but maybe there's a report that they do every year where they misspell their own name or they misspell the word objective or something that seems seemingly more important than an email. And so you just continue working your way up. And what this does is it loosens people's thinking. They start to understand that mistakes are not as catastrophic as they think. And probably more importantly, they learn that they can tolerate the distress and anxiety that comes with it.
Okay. And so what I'm hoping to accomplish there is to relieve some of that stress, some of that obsession on perfectionism. And am I also, though, then providing them, but and what you do on a daily basis, this part of it, this is where we're looking for that higher standard. And is that part of it? In other words, and I'm not want to communicate that sloppiness, the way a perfectionist would interpret it, is acceptable. It's just an exercise to get us to let go of that fear of making a mistake. Am I getting this right?
So you would do it in the context of the exercises. So this would not be done 24/7. But what I would suggest is that you have a system and a culture in place where you really focus on identifying what deserves emphasis B, what deserves emphasis A, what deserves emphasis
Okay.
C,
Okay.
because mistakes are going to happen and people need to learn how to deal with that. But you don't want necessarily a universal level of sloppiness.
Right. Right.
But you also want people to allocate their effort to the appropriate things as a business owner, things that are truly important,
Okay.
right? If somebody is going to not misspell something in an email, but it costs you a client, is that worth it? Right? Because maybe they spent so much time on that email that they never were able to reach out to make that contact for
Right.
a new client. So the idea is, what is it costing you to emphasis A, all of these tasks? I think that is a mistake. And so setting up a culture where you triage, or you sort of think about prioritizing what deserves emphasis A effort, what deserves emphasis B, and what are things that you can just straight up skip.
Right. Understood. Okay. And so, for example, if one of the things is the common is, my shipping department and making sure I get the order packed and shipped correctly, that probably for my business deserves an emphasis A. We're going to measure it, we're going to track it. So I'm making it very clear and transparent. This is a point of emphasis for us where we have a high standard, right? We're not trying to achieve 100%, but we want to keep our error rate to a certain percentage. That's an example perhaps where I might bring emphasis A to that task.
Absolutely. And that's dependent on your values and what your company finds to be the most valuable and important. That could be for your company, but you go to the company next door and they think that in the long run, it's not worth the hours and the money to spend that much time laboring over packaging and getting things correct, because it only misfires
Yeah.
0.0003% of
Yeah.
the time.
I mean, you could argue that's kind of not too bashing, but that's kind of where Amazon is to an extent, right? The volume for them, they're going to get it mostly right. I mean, they're trying to have a standard, I'm sure, but their thing is let's get it out fast, right? That's probably more their emphasis than that it be perfect 100% of the time. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And their calculus includes bad debt, the problems of having to ship things back or deal with
Mm-hmm.
customer support. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's just the way it goes.
That's right. That's right. They'll deal with that. In fact, you can add it on to they don't as often they don't necessarily even want it back. But yeah, so I'm understanding where you're going there.
And what's interesting is that the clients or the customers have already sort of implicitly understood this. You kind of order from Amazon knowing that you should check your package because it's very possible it's not
Mm-hmm.
what you want it to be.
Right.
And I find that it's very much the case that the package is not what I want it to be, probably
Mm-hmm.
more of the time than if I get some private sender, a company sending me something. They do tend to have more care,
Yeah.
probably because the infrastructure can't support all the returns and dealing with irate customers.
Right. Good point. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas Amazon can, and they've got a system in place to deal with that as effectively as possible.
Right.
Okay, great. Thanks for explaining that and going into detail there.
Absolutely.
In the book, of course, then you lay out several ways, including, of course, this emphasis framework that you've introduced for us. But what are some of the other ways to overcome perfectionism, if you can just introduce them, that you go into much more detail on in the book, especially from the perspective, again, of a small business owner?
Yeah, so the solutions really are two avenues. One is the top down and the other is the bottom up. Top down is really meant for creating an anti-perfectionistic culture, making sure that your environment is set up for flexibility and principle-based action, not rules. And really, how do you set this up in your environment? Things like the employee handbook, annual evaluations that value certain types of tendencies, through communication and reward systems. Believe it or not, a reward system very much can signal perfectionism. If you have a whiteboard at the office with your top sales agents, that for some people is extremely powerful and motivating, and for other people is extremely demoralizing.
Mm-hmm.
And you could be putting in 120% effort and not be on that board and think, what's the point? Why try? And it could be really demoralizing, and you start to get into some burnout, quiet quitting, some other types of tendencies. And so the leaders are thinking, oh, we'll just use this to inspire people. There'll be some friendly competition, and that probably works for a lot of people. But then there are the others who you're essentially uh, you know, putting into the corner and probably not motivating and doing the opposite. And so I don't know that those systems need to be removed, but I think you should at least go in eyes wide open, knowing that that's a very big potential cost of doing something like that.
And my thought on something like that, Greg, is that we have to achieve to that certain sales number. That's what keeps our business alive and growing. But maybe, what if I complemented something like that with also equally measuring and making transparent our client satisfaction score, as an example, and
Yep.
being that an equal component of your compensation, let's say, or somewhat equal component.
Yep. And that's exactly right. Make sure that it's not just based on dollar amount brought in, that people do things in a way that's more indirect for the company, that ultimately, if you wanted to monetize it and figure out what it's costing or not costing your company, you can do that. but things, like citizenship and client satisfaction, going that extra mile, like those, attitude, these things are really important for the workplace. If your workplace is toxic, but everyone's doing a really good job at selling, you're just going to have so much turnover that it's really not going to matter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. We're going to sell, but we're not going to be able to deliver, at least not consistently. Yeah.
Right. And so you're going to have to deal with the costs associated with all of that. And it's probably going to eat into whatever star sales you're getting.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that you make a good point there. So a lot of the top down stuff is about messaging and how do you make sure that your environment doesn't send some of these messages, and how to send messages about psychological safety and innovation and that kind of stuff. The bottom up ones are more about how do you work with a very specific employee who's struggling with this. And it's things like enhancing flexibility. How do you do that? Well, there are strategies that you can use during the day that really work with the individual to promote flexibility. Maybe they have certain tasks that get done all the time, but they're done in this sort of rigid, specific order or specific formula. Well, have them come in and randomly do them in a random order, not knowing what their day is going to look like. This is extremely uncomfortable for
Right.
people, but if they get used to it, it almost becomes predictable unpredictability, and they start to loosen up. They start to realize that they can't control everything and that there's a little bit of fluidity to their day. This is also similar for cross training, right? If you can cross train people to be the host and the waiter and the cook and the bus boy. I don't even know if they call that anymore. The bus person.
The bus person. Yeah.
The idea is that if you can cross train and then they don't know which task they're doing that day, and you sort of randomize them to that, that also could be a way to increase flexibility.
I see.
And you don't need to do this with just one employee. You could do this with a bunch, or you could just do it with one. The other thing I encourage people to do is not encourage or enable safety behavior. So really talk about how you can limit enabling safety behaviors like procrastination, asking for continual deadline extensions, seeking reassurance about the quality of something over and over and over and over again. This is really common among perfectionists. Does this look okay? How does this look? What about now? Is this better? That kind of stuff can really become grating on the people around you and cause team dynamic issues. And so learning how to stop that kind of safety behavior, or at least not encouraging it and setting boundaries around that with your employees.
Right. And I can see where I, as the owner in a small organization, can encourage that, can create that, can further emphasize that, because if I'm bringing my perfectionism to the work environment, my teams are reacting to it, and in particular, someone who in turn is a perfectionist themselves. I'm creating that environment where nobody's ever sure if I'm going to think it's going to be good enough, or I'm always going to have an opinion as to what you could have done better. Even though I delegated it to you, I'm still going to have a judgment on how it could have been done better if I had done it, really is what I'm saying.
Exactly. And I do flip the script in chapter 10 and talk about perfectionistic bosses and how to deal with them. And I think that it does dive into that a little bit. How do you deal with someone where you're working for them and nothing ever feels like it's just right or where it needs to be, even though if it seems reasonable and high quality? What do you do in those situations? And talk about how do you handle what I call reversal reassurance seeking, role reversal reassurance seeking, where the boss is constantly asking their employees whether they're doing a good job as a supervisor. How are you feeling about like that rule? It's almost like the parent asking the child how their parenting is going. And I think it really creates this atmosphere of low confidence and credibility. And it's really, I think, an interesting phenomenon. And so a lot of the stuff that I talk about related to this comes back to interpersonal interactions and communication. And so part of the book, I talk about something called social capital, which is a concept, it's a metaphor for the idea that we all have these social capital bank accounts with the people around us. They only go one direction. You have one with your spouse, and I have one, and that spouse has one with you. You have one with your boss has one with you. And so you can spend and recharge these accounts with various behaviors. And I think that a lot of leadership and management don't often consider these kind of social capital expenditures when they're making decisions in the workplace.
Right, right. Excellent. Well said. A lot of great takeaways and actionable stuff there. Thank you for sharing, Greg. The book, again, that we're talking about is Greg's latest book, Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. Speaking of books, we'll have a link to this one, of course, on the show notes page, but is there another book that you would recommend that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think if you're looking for your own self-discovery and trying to address some of your own perfectionistic tendencies, the book I recommend is a cognitive behavioral workbook or self-help book called When Perfect Isn't Good Enough by New Harbinger Press. And it's written by Anthony and Swinton, and it is the go-to for CBT or cognitive behavior therapy for perfectionism from a self-help perspective. And I think if you can do the exercises in there and learn a little bit about your own tendencies, I think it can help the workplace.
Excellent. If I am one of those business owners has gotten to here just by overcoming that perfectionism, but what would you, reading the book is a first step, but what would you say is a way to get started for me to make sure I get that in control, get it in check so that it doesn't continue to impact my small business negatively? Where do I start?
I absolutely, Henry, would suggest you pick up 1 or 1,000 of my books and you start there and you just read through that. No, I think the best place to start would be with yourself. You can't really do much about perfectionism in your workplace if you're not modeling anti-perfectionistic tendencies yourself. And you mentioned this earlier, and I think it's clutch. I mean, you again, it's very similar to what we were talking about before. The words coming out of your mouth might say one thing, but your behavior is saying another.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an example where you really want to focus in on yourself. What am I doing? And how am I modeling perfectionistic tendencies, and what can I do about that? And then once I sort of have a better sense of that, then I would go and I would start to assess the environment around me, look at some of the messaging for the hiring or onboarding, look at some of the cultural tendencies in the workplace and expectations. Are they rigid? Are they excessive given industry standards?
Right.
Are they, am I, are we sort of addicted to rules? Are we hyper focused on them? Another tendency is for people with perfectionism to become quite moralistic and to hold other people to really rigid moral standards.
Right.
And so what that creates is this self-righteousness and this really toxic work environment. And so are we seeing people who are policing these rules and being essentially sanctimonious in the workplace?
Yeah.
And then can we figure out how to put a stop to that? People end up trying to be the sheriff in town and it causes problems. And that's not to say people should be breaking rules left and right, but
no. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, and it's interesting. We were talking about this earlier, and I lost a point, but I remembered it. This in particular, I'm generalizing, but the younger generation is much more, I think, I don't know, I'm not going to use the right words, but more sensitive to this, or they respond to this, where it impacts them more. They look more for work environments where this doesn't happen for all kinds of good reasons, right? Versus my generation, we just put up with it, right? They know now that there's an alternative, that there's a different environment that can be had. And then going back to the point of perfectionism that I forgot to highlight, ask you, certainly they have the additional input of everything that social media has brought about as to what is the perfect life and the perfect way to look and be and do, right?
yeah. So on the one hand, the social media makes everything curated and look perfect, but it's not. So it creates this illusion that
illusion. Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's never been a better time for getting good data on what is industry standard. So,
Yeah, good point.
if you think that your employer is asking for things that are excessive and rigid, well, it's pretty easy to find out. You just hop on Glassdoor or whatever,
Exactly.
and you'll figure it out pretty quickly. And I think that's good for employers. I mean, it's tough in that everything is transparent. You can't get away with much anymore these days, right?
That's
But
right.
it's good in that you can know whether or not you're paying correctly or that your hours are reasonable. And you're still potentially going to have the tug of dealing with, the the overhead versus the, what you're bringing in. But
Sure.
in the end, that, oh my gosh, I'm paying my employees 20% less than the industry standard, or the expectation for sales is way above the industry standard. There's no better time than now to be able to find that information.
Agreed. So much more transparency and sharing of that information that's available to us, just online.
Right.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up here, Greg. What's one thing you want us to take away from what we've talked about, and I guess related, of course, to the key message, one of the key messages from the book, but what's one thing you want us to take away from this conversation?
I would say the number one thing is to be considerate about perfectionism in your workplace. Try to mitigate the damage it's causing and try to facilitate the good qualities that come with it. This does not mean weeding out perfectionists in the workplace.
Yeah. Excellent. Where do you want us to go online to learn more?
The book can be checked out at flawedbook.com, which is a bit of a funny URL, flawedbook.com. And there you can learn more about it.
Wonderful. Greg, thanks for spending the time with me today, sharing this information. It's a great book that I had the privilege of previewing before this call. But thanks for taking the time to be with me today.
Thank you so much. I had a blast.
This is Henry Lopez, and thanks for all of you for joining me on this episode of The How of Business. My guest today again is Dr. Greg Chasson, and I release new episodes every Monday morning, so you can find the show anywhere you listen to podcasts, including the How of Business YouTube channel, at the website, thehowofbusiness.com. You can find everything there, including the show notes page for this episode. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you for listening to The How of Business. For more information about our coaching programs, online courses, show notes pages, links, and other resources, please visit thehowofbusiness.com.